Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is James Rogers. I'm the Director of Business Development at the Global Cold Chain Alliance. I'm excited to get the program started today, where our speakers will be talking about how IoT is revolutionizing real-time cold chain monitoring. But first, to set the stage, I'll be providing a little background information on who the Global Cold Chain Alliance is and some high-level trends, opportunities, and challenges facing the industry. The Global Cold Chain Alliance is a member-based trade association with the vision of forging a universally strong cold chain where every product retains quality and safety through each link. GCCA serves more than 1,300 companies in 80 countries who serve the food industry by providing third-party, temperature-controlled supply chain services, in addition, facility design, construction services, all the tools, technologies, and solutions to support needs across the cold chain. Annually, the association releases a top 25 list of third-party refrigerated warehousing and logistics providers by capacity, which was just published in this month. The data showed that members grew an average of 3% by company in capacity from 2017 to 2018. Across the industry, capacity has been extremely tight as manufacturers build up their inventory and demands from retailers to be in stock in full and on time. Although warehouses are full and the need for people is continually growing. We are also seeing an increase in automation with labor challenges. Finding people is top of the list for cold chain players no matter what segment. Consolidation in the industry continues to thrive. We also see continual interest from private equity entering the industry. As you may have just seen in recent news, Fred Bowler and his team from Americold rang the bell at the New York Stock Exchange, which was the first member to go public. Finally, consumer trends continually evolve. The trends for fresh products continue. As that space grows, we see huge opportunities for companies looking to diversify their customer base. We also see end users looking for third party as a complete supply chain provider and also provide customized value-added services. The association develops resources to address these needs and keeps members abreast of the ever-evolving landscape in the cold chain. To experience and discuss these topics live, we invite you to participate in this year's education program at the Global Cold Chain Expo in June, where you can meet Aeris in person and dive deeper into these items and more. Our speakers today are excited to share how IoT can help handle these issues in real time with an entire infrastructure reacting as a single unit. But before I turn it over to our first presenter, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items so you know how to participate in today's event. We've taken a screenshot that you'll see of an example of attendees interface. You should see something that looks like this on your computer desk in the upright right-hand corner. You'll be listening and using your computer speaker system by default. If you would prefer to join over the phone, just select telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions, or today's presenters will be typing your questions into the question pane on the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. We will also have a number of poll questions for you to participate throughout the webinar. When you see these questions pop up, click directly on your screen to participate. To test out what this looks like, we'll be practicing one now.
This will be what the results of the poll will look like, and then when an actual poll pops up, you'll have the chance to click directly on the answer that you want to use.
Finally, we have a couple takeaways for you. Downloadable from the GoToWebinar panel, you should see a handout in the PDF form titled, How Can Cold Chain Monitoring Reduce Logistics Costs? And Cold Chain Industry Brief. Please send us a question if you have trouble downloading and we will email you a copy. Also, there will be a copy of the recording of the webinar available for your reference or to share with team members. You'll receive a copy of this recording in follow-up email within 24 hours of the event. I would now like to introduce our first speaker on today's education event, Chief Technology Officer Z. Hussain.
Thank you, James. So let me get started. First thing that we have, let's see, we're going to transition over to my slides. I don't see it up on the screen yet. The first thing we're going to do is a poll. What is your company's current use for remote monitoring? There are 4 answers that we're hoping to get some understanding of as to what your current usage is. First, you don't have one. You're using it to manage your location and or temperature safety. You're looking to implement in the next 6 to 12 months. And of course, if there is some other use case that you would like to identify by clicking on that 4th button, we'd appreciate it. That'll give us some information about your current use of remote monitoring. So we'll give you a few seconds to answer that. Let's see what the answers look like. Okay, good. Looks like, Vidya, I'll ask you as well, perhaps, to comment on this. It looks like there's about 13% who don't have one, and more than half want to be able to use it for current use to manage location and or temperature safety, which makes sense since this is a cold chain monitoring webinar. You're looking to implement is about 13%, and you have some other use case, which is at 17%. Vidya, do you have any comments on that poll?
It is a good indication, Z, of what we're going to talk through, including addressing why it's important to not only the folks using it, but some of the new technologies that are coming out that would enhance current methodology.
Very good. All right, well, let's dive right in. And if we can move to the first slide after the poll. I haven't seen the first slide yet. Have I got the control part?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Sure.
All right. So IoT is revolutionizing, how IoT is revolutionizing real-time cold chain monitoring. You have my particulars up there, but you'll also get the opportunity to be able to get a copy of this presentation later on and get the information you need to contact me if you want to. All right, so let me dive right in. My very first slide is about Aeris, who we are, what we do, and what we're up to. Our presence information is basically that we're located in Silicon Valley in the San Jose area. That's where our headquarters are. But as you can see, we have offices and operations around the world because we are providing global services. We have operations in San Jose, Chicago, in the UK, in India, and Japan. And we have network operating centers for our services in San Jose, Vegas, London, and Delhi in India, along with some cloud-based data centers located in the Far East and Europe as well. The reason we have these remote data centers is because we're providing capability for IoT services in general in more than 180 countries at this point, and with applications in a variety of different markets. Today, we're the 6th largest in the cellular IoT arena when you measure from the perspective of units, and we're supporting over 1.5 billion messages per day at the present time. The markets we serve are the connected car markets, fleet markets, which is where supply chain and cold chain monitoring falls into, healthcare, financial, industrial IoT, and utilities. I'm going to go into one more poll because I'm going to be touching on communications methodologies for this kind of monitoring today. So I'd like to understand what people are using in this area. So the question is, what kind of communications do you use for monitoring today? Is it cellular? Is it Wi-Fi? Is it satellite-based or some other technology that you are using? This will give me an indication of the kinds of solutions that people are either using or looking for. And today's snapshot would be very good. So we'll give people a chance to input which one of these is useful for them. Please vote by clicking on one of the little buttons. Okay, like we can move to the results. Okay, very good. So 50%, more than 50%, just over 50% are using cellular. Wi-Fi and satellite are very low, 5 to 5, less than 10%, 5% for Wi-Fi, 5% for satellite. It looks like about 38% have some other communications methodologies. Obviously, we'd love to explore this further in the future, but I should emphasize that we are a cellular company. We provide services on cellular, so that is a good place for us to continue focusing on. And as you'll hear, that's an area where we feel there's a lot of advantage to long-range communications down the road. And I'll give you a slide near the end of my presentation that talks about what's happening in the cellular space. All right, let's go back to my deck. The first slide that I have is on supply chain management in general. Now, the reason I put this up is because cold chain is a part of this entire flow where monitoring is important, where you can see the product flow going from the left to the right. I'm sure many of you all have seen very similar presentations of the information that is on the screen right now, where you have information going the other direction. Now, one of the things that I've seen in other presentations is that they tend not to talk about the fact that money flow goes from right to left as well. And it's something that the kind of information that you would see going back is useful all the way back into the chain. Now, one thing that I've added over here is that you don't traditionally see vendors and suppliers as being part of the supply chain management, but that has become a much more important part of the picture over here. And clearly, when you have new product development going on from companies that need to provide specifications and use those specifications to select vendors and suppliers, the management process, the information management process, they become part of that chain. So I've extended this chart a little bit further to the left of manufacturing. Within manufacturing, you obviously have movement within the factory. We're providing services to a number of companies who are using RFID and automated barcode scanning systems for controlling the flow within the factory itself. And then, of course, once it leaves the manufacturing facility and goes into the delivery of that product, managing the data from that device units that are out in the field, for the devices that are out in the field, through the process of getting into the warehouse, doing inventory management, and the last mile delivery, which is a very cold chain manufacturing, cold chain monitoring, if you will, becomes much more critical than not because of some of the applications that you see in the short range transports that are used for last mile delivery are always a little difficult to decide where the data is coming from, where the data is located, and can it be kept under the appropriate temperature conditions so that excursions don't occur. And then, of course, monitoring it at the business or consumer where that product was delivered. This flow is very typical, and of course, it is an overview of the entire process that cold chain monitoring fits into. Now, let me give you a couple of stats on the supply chain management and the impact that is having on the industry as a whole. First of all, there has been a fairly rapid growth in automation. A number of years ago, there was a study done that showed in a survey that 60% of organizations were looking at automation, and there was an estimate made at that time, which appears to be coming true, that by the end of this year, about 83% of the organizations that are involved in the supply chain management are pursuing automation. From the perspective of transportation logistics, the Council on Supply Chain Management Professionals have estimated that in 2017, the U.S. spending exceeded $1.5 trillion. And globally, the shipments in 2017 were about 9.5 billion tons by sea and 42 billion tons by air. There is an estimate by the American Trucking Association for drivers shortages. In 2014, the shortfall was estimated at about 35,000. At the start of 2017, more than 100,000 drivers were not available for the kinds of transportation requirements that the trucking industry had just in the United States alone. I think there's one little interesting trend that is going to help that, which is the concept of autonomous trucking, where the vehicles are under control of a system rather than necessarily a driver. And the first example of this took place in October of 2017, where a company called Otto delivered 50,000 cans of beer along a controlled path, the highway from Fort Collins to Colorado Springs. The fact that this is, I think, a very interesting trend is going to help the projected shortfall of drivers who could provide that human touch, if you will, But the fact that it's going to become a more autonomous delivery system and delivery mechanism just makes monitoring of that process equally more important, if you will. Now, when you look at supply chain monitoring, which is the requirements that are intended for supply chain monitoring, there are four areas that I want to emphasize. One is that you need global connectivity. The data must be transmitted anywhere in the world. The short-range wireless that is used for some kinds of data tracking, along with satellite and cellular, where the data is transmitted anywhere that it's necessary to be transmitted. The other requirement is for centralized management, where people can have timely access to the data on any asset that's in motion. The inventory and asset management avoids the losses that people can incur, because if you don't have any kind of an asset management system, you're not going to know where problems occur. Data logging is important. There is global storage of information flow. Where is that information being generated? Where is it being transmitted? And of course, the traceability, the end-to-end traceability is vital to quality. As you have seen from recent incidents, perhaps in the food industry, where the ability to locate where a particular shipment originated from is essential, maybe perhaps where a particular farm was involved, because they can trace back problems that they might have discovered. So that logging, the storage is extremely important. And as all of these transports, product transports become global, being able to store the data around the world may become more and more important down the road. Very important to maintain data security. You have to allow for people to have authorized access to the information. And very, very, very important, there is some new privacy legislation in the works, particularly in Europe, for example, with what's called the GDPR. The requirement and legislation is going to make it really tough for us to make sure that you have information stored just the right place with just the right content to avoid violating those regulations, because the penalties are kind of harsh, and we need to be aware of that. Cold chain monitoring has some specific additional requirements. On my next slide, you will see that there are needs that are kind of unique, perhaps, to cold chain monitoring that may not be necessary for overall supply chain monitoring in general, but it can assist with that as well. First of all, there is a requirement for real-time data, and that's the purpose behind the whole presentation that we have today over here, and Vidya is going to elaborate on that a little bit more in a few minutes. Basically, you need to be able to get timely temperature excursion reports. The whole point is that temperature can change, but it changes, fortunately, slowly enough that you might be able to take action before the product spoils or some kind of loss occurs. That's the nature of being able to get to that real-time data just in time to make some useful action from that data. Clearly, you also have to have remote data logging, where you're going to need to have temperature integrity, maintain the logging of that temperature integrity, and potentially provide warranties that the product you were shipping did not exceed the limits that were set. So there's additional data recording requirements in the entire flow above and beyond sort of traditional supply chain, because you need to record items that are critical to the cold chain transport process. Another important requirement is in the global healthcare industry. We're starting to see increasing cold chain monitoring use in developing nations, in particular for delivery of medication that needs to stay within certain temperature ranges. We're working with some firms that are providing this capability to monitor and control temperatures literally in the entire process from manufacturing to end point of use. That last mile problem, certainly in some of the developing nations, is incredibly difficult. And so there are methods and processes that are being developed to both manage that, report on it, and then take action if there's some issue. The point over here is that with the healthcare requirements and population growth and the shipment traffic growth, you need to be able to scale very, very effectively. That's a requirement that wasn't as important in the past, perhaps, but it's certainly becoming even more important for cold chain monitoring in the near future. Finally, analytics. It is important and necessary to get real-time data, to get the logging, to be able to take action on excursions. But what if you could predict and prevent them in the first place? If you see patterns where issues can occur, then those patterns can allow you to predict what might be a problem and take action before the temperature excursion occurs and a report is generated. This is something that a number of companies, including the Roambee operation, is going to talk about a little bit more in a few minutes. The Roambee is taking that into account as well to be able to do predictions. On my next slide, I'm going to talk about the connectivity and what is the data in the cold chain path, where cellular is what we feel is the most cost effective. And as the poll showed earlier, a lot of people are indeed using this. For short-range wireless methodologies, RFID is in common use. Wi-Fi and Bluetooth data from sensors is very common use, but clearly that data has to be sent somewhere to take action. And long-range wireless is very, very commonly used for these purposes for obvious reasons. Cellular is typically used for cellular and land transports, for air and land transports, and satellites are typically used for ocean-based shipping. Not surprisingly, because there is no cellular out there. We don't see as much cellular use within the continental US, for example, because the cellular systems are, in general, providing very effective coverage across the board for everybody. There is a need for global data access. We need to be able to store the data into storage systems, data storage systems around the world. We have data centers for exactly that purposes around the world for our customers in IoT, and that can be used for cold chain data as well. One thing to be aware of is that many countries have information transport rules, meaning that data generated within the country may not necessarily be able to leave the physical boundaries of that country into servers that are located elsewhere. So we have taken actions in certain countries to be able to provide local storage for that information, where then the actions can be operated on using either analytics or real-time responses, if you will, to certain reports that are generated out in the field right there locally in that country. Finally, it is very important to have single pane visibility for the management of the data and the devices. Even though you may have devices around the world, as global coverage for location and data is necessary, and you have to have a uniform cellular behavior in that entire coverage footprint to be able to successfully deploy the applications, you need to be able to see that information from a single pane. And that's important to us and to our customers. So we do that very carefully to make sure that access to the information, access to the device, access to what is being transmitted from that device is available to anybody who needs to know. On my final slide, I'm going to talk about some of the next generation communications that are in development and also in deployment. There are a few new standards coming along which people may not be entirely familiar with, so I'll touch on them briefly. Obviously, these topics are something that would take a lot more effort and time to detail out. So if people have questions later on, they can certainly contact us. First, there is this concept of the Low Power Radio Alliance, which was originally developed as an open standard, and it enables private networks, particularly for factories and yards. But there are companies who are attempting to deploy these on a larger scale. The reason this is very important is because LoRa allows and enables battery-powered sensors using unlicensed spectrum. So you can create a local network for monitoring product and inventory within factories, within yards, or literally within a few tens of miles potentially. Generally speaking, less than 10 miles from a given base station to a radio, but up to a few tens of miles if you implement multiple base stations. This allows people to deploy private networks using battery-powered sensors in a very simple way. For longer range transport, there are two new technologies in the works that also are battery-powered, but they use licensed spectrum. So companies like ourselves and some of the cellular providers are making this available for people who need to send data further than the same as traditional cellular, but further than where LoRa with private networks would enable. These include two technologies called Cat-M and narrowband IoT. They're going to be longer range public networks. They're just starting to get deployed, so you don't have a lot of countries providing these technologies yet, but that's going to change in the near future. And obviously within the next 4 to 5 years, you'll start to see 5G cellular becoming more common, where data for autonomous vehicle management in particular, and also the autonomous trucking industry will become possible and enable that capability. I do believe that trucking industry will go autonomous sooner than vehicles, because trucks tend to move, certainly long-haul trucks tend to move in constrained pathways along highways, where demonstrations like the OTTO, the company who demonstrated the 50,000 cans of beer being moved from one location to another completely autonomously are possible and viable in the future. Finally, something which is a little bit further away, maybe 4 to 8 years, is that there are a number of companies who are deploying LEO satellite-based data transport for exactly these kinds of applications, low Earth orbit satellites. These are very tiny nanosatellite constellations, shoebox size, literally. They're maybe about 10 centimeters by 10 centimeters in size, and these satellite deployments will allow us to be able to access the data consistent with the way that the requirements for cellular exist, meaning you can do cellular anywhere that there is land-based availability of towers and satellites where there isn't, in a way that we believe will be very, very, the best way to say it is that they will be consistently similar from a technology transport perspective. Some of these LEO satellites will be using radios that are traditionally used in the cellular space. So that's pretty much all the slides that I had to do. My next slide just has a little bit more information about the company and how to reach us. Obviously, people who would download this deck later on will have access to the email and the phone numbers that you can reach us at. I'd like to hand the baton back to Vidya, who is going to talk about the Roambee solution.
Thank you, Z. Really appreciate the walkthrough on connectivity. I'll talk a little bit more about that in the context of some of the solutions that we're looking at. But as we get started, just wanted to throw out a question there. I know we talked about how many people were using it, but switching a little bit, if you're not using a real-time monitoring system, what's holding you back? And the context here is real-time. It would be an interesting context switch to knowing about your environment and knowing about it in the ability to react immediately. And I can see that, there are some situations where real-time would be very appropriate, but there are also situations where it involves a little bit of process to work with it. So interestingly enough, very good feedback. And I'll talk through about why we exist as a company, and it's probably to address the first 2 points very, very clearly, that it is actually affordable and very, very reliable, including certain pharma-grade situations. But this is a great insight, and I'll make it more contextual to what we're talking about. So Roambee is a company. We're based in Santa Clara, California. We have a global footprint. Me, as one of the product officers in the company, focus really on our solutions and work very closely in the field to get our solutions very close to our customers' needs. One point I wanted to bring out is the RFID experience the team brings in. We've spent over a decade working with RFID technologies, both active and passive, to look at monitoring both within a warehouse and within facilities. And one of the reasons we talk about real-time monitoring and in transit in the next 20 minutes will show the differentiation between how technology has improved to make it more affordable and easily deployable. Roambee's IoT solution is really built on a few tenets. One of them is the ability to really make unit economics work. I saw the poll response of things being expensive. And one of the reasons we wanted to change that was to address not only the expense of the overall solution, but also the unit economics where it can scale beyond a closed loop solution. So one of the things that we're focused on is not just the in-transit visibility, but visibility within, I'd say it's refrigerated zones, refrigerated transit zones, and warehouses. So in that context, what we really wanted to do was build a solution that is easily deployable, has very little infrastructure needs, has an OpEx model, which I'll get to a little further down, which makes it easily adoptable, and works across industries. Most people, when they look at the cold chain, are thinking either pharmaceutical or produce. And I'll touch upon examples and tell you stories about our last 4 years of experience where this has gone beyond just the traditional industries as we know it, and has taken this into a situation where we can actually learn over time. So we're looking at things along insurance reduction. We're thinking around spoilage and claims management, which comes up a lot. And overall, producing a industry SLA, if you will, that is far more dependable than the current point solutions where we have to call a lot of people either by phone or by other forms of communication. Our service model is very simple. What we're looking to do, unlike the RFID days or unlike purchasing hardware from vendors, is to really adopt a visibility model. You pay as you go, you scale as you grow. You can integrate this into your current systems, which means brownfield. If you've got existing systems today, this could work very well in conjunction with what you have. And at the end of the day, do it yourself. You're not looking at a very large engagement, if you will. And all of this becomes important. We've got customers both in North America and in international geographies that have adopted this and have been in deployment and test within a day. And that changes the paradigm of how people can evaluate some of the new real-time visibility models. How is this enabled? We hear a lot about IoT. We hear a lot about the different technologies of communication in terms of being able to send information from a device or a truck or a warehouse into the cloud and be able to then pass that information on to everybody else. On one side, Roambee manages the connectivity. Z talked a lot about the different ways of doing things. And connectivity is becoming cheap. It's becoming ubiquitous. And the responsibility now is being able to scale this. Unlike 5-10 years ago, you can now have a connectivity model across North America, LATAM, or Europe for a single price point, if you will. All of this is tied back to being able to get the data. In our 4 or 5 years of making sure that we can build scalable systems, we've tried a lot of systems from Alibaba or any other eBay source that sells you GPS trackers or things of that nature. What really came about was the ability to make it enterprise grade. That would mean security, that would mean manageability, and that would mean ease of deployment. And I'll talk a little bit more about why those are important and why we've made it economically viable. So one of the reasons we're doing this today is to kind of elaborate on the fact that it is a single visibility solution. If you look at a lot of point solutions in the market, you're probably looking at different vendors or different solutions to manage connectivity, the hardware, the deployment, and the overall environment, if you will. Yet what we've tried to do is make it as simple as a one-point click where you're able to inject intelligence into whatever you're monitoring, be it a warehouse or be it a in-transit vehicle, and be able to get that level of visibility. I'll transition a little bit to some stories, and this will probably resonate a little bit more with why we're doing what we're doing. And one of the key things that I get to talk about to customers is the ability for them to do something about their entire supply chain. We've got customers that manufacture it, we've got customers that move the product, and we've got customers that retail the product. And I've got a common theme through it, which is, what do I really do even if I know something is going wrong? And the answer is, it's the ability to know how far ahead so you're able to make that decision. We've had a customer that was moving cheese across the United States. And one of the things they were able to do was recall trucks within the first 100 miles of it leaving a factory or a warehouse, where they were able to then understand that the reefer unit was not actually being set at the right temperature. And one of the things that we showed them across that was not the fact that the temperature was slowly decreasing, but the fact that it was going to be a 4-day journey, and over 4 days, the damage that could have been done was well worth having the truck come back and talk to the driver. And interestingly enough, a lot of you would be aware of this, where they did call the driver in advance and asked the driver what the temperature was, and the driver said the temperature was in the nominal range, while the machine was telling us differently. The world, in our view, should go to machine data, because they have no incentive, if you will, to provide incorrect data. So part of our stories include the ability to react. In that ability to react, if you will, you can really temper the amount of claims you get and the potential for spoilage. One of the things that we were looking at in terms of total visibility is looking at things like the mean kinetic temperature. What we're looking at is not necessarily that the temperature went up 1 or 2 degrees over a period of an hour or two. We want to know what that impact is to the entire product set. So for example, we've got customers that monitor ice cream. And a lot of times, based on seasonality, they rent trucks from companies such as Penske or Ryder, which are not flatbed freezer trucks. These are, blower cooler trucks. And for them to know that the blower is not maintaining temperature lets them know that they've got 6 to 8 hours, if you will, to react to that ice cream, if you will, getting below a condition where they can't potentially use it anymore. So there is the ability to manage spoilage risk, and in that capacity, do things that were potentially never capable before. Things like rerouting shipments. We've got situations where we were able to have customers send the truck to a repair facility and have the reefer fixed, especially on continental moves such as from the West Coast to East Coast and vice versa. We've also got situations where we have a lot of customers doing cross-dock cold chain moves. And in that capacity, the product remains in an open area within a cross-dock facility, even though it's only for a matter of a few hours. And an example of that, which was not intuitive to us, actually, was wine shipments. And these were air freight wine shipments going from California to the rest of the United States. And what we found was they were going on 2-day shipments. And in the summer, they were sitting on the ramp in Memphis while waiting to get to its final destination, and they realized that the temperature was getting to 70 and 80 degrees Fahrenheit. And what we were able to do was help them change the packing methodology that they used to then have the same shipments go through with the same SLAs that they were giving their customers. So not only are we looking at an environment where you can think of in the traditional sense, are you at the right temperature? Now start thinking of how IoT can take you to the future where you can predict potential issues and change some of your operational processes. And that brings a good transition into economics. A lot of our customers now are looking at saying, hey, I'm now in control of my temperature. I'm in control of how my product goes through its delivery life cycle. How can I be more efficient? How can I change this paradigm of just traditional transportation into now using some of this IoT information, if you will, to drive to redefining how I look at transportation. We've got a lot of customers that work with very common retailers. You look at Costco, you look at Sam's Club, or you look at large big box retailers, and the ability to meet some of their SLAs, especially in cold chain deliveries, whereby the truck's not waiting outside. Everybody's been through that, where you have demurrage, detention costs, not just within the continental US, but we see this a lot, especially when it's transitioning across borders, be it between the Mexican-US border or from regions of a lot of fruit produce, Costa Rica, things like that, into the continental US, where we have customs controls and things like that. In terms of the transportation costs and the ability to manage them, we're also looking at planned delivery. We're looking at potential visibility into more efficient ETAs that could basically tie in things like the weather things like, the traffic, which we're already aware of, but also starting to look at real futuristic things such as the average transition through a port. And all of this matters, especially in cold chain, more so than the regular transition chain. The interesting things with all of this is, how do you then control this from a overall costing perspective? We're looking at future growth. We're looking at having everything in your cold chain at the item level, if you will be controlled. An example that we're looking at from a futuristic perspective is not just temperature. We're also looking at humidity and pressure tying to temperature. So when we're looking at chocolate movements from LATAM into the continental US, one would not intuitively think of it as cold chain, but humidity and temperature have a direct effect into coffee, into chocolate, into non-traditional product movement, which then can be easily controlled with these new sensors that can provide you with information that goes beyond the traditional data loggers that we are aware of, such as the temp tails and such as the fixed loggers within reefers and things like that, such as the OrbCom fixed units or anything else from Thermo King. Now looking at sensors that go beyond that, we're looking at a futuristic approach where you're also looking at supplier management. You're looking at being able to now not have your supplier put any new infrastructure. You can actually extend your visibility infrastructure without them having to then have new equipment purchases or anything to then comply with your regulations. It's an interesting paradigm change that's going to not only affect people that supply, but it also potentially affects people that are on the receiving end of things. What does all of this mean at the end of the day to everybody along the cold chain, if you will? One of the key things is incident management. We've all been through it at some point in time. It could be simply a claim that there was spoilage that occurred. It could be liability when you're looking at a pharmaceutical environment and things of that nature. All of this, if we look at the holistic global supply chain, can be managed now with an economic IoT sensor base. Think about it as being able to show from the time it touched the supply chain. So when you're looking at farm to fork, from the moment it was harvested from a produce perspective, or the moment it was manufactured from a vaccine perspective, if we had visibility across different touch points. So a typical touch point would be a manufacturer moving it on to a trailer, to a transporter, maybe moving it on to a storage facility, ultimately going to retail. Now imagine a sensor was going through this entire environment at a price point that was probably negligible compared to what you're looking at today. So imagine something where you're looking to track this at $1 a day for your entire visibility of multiple pallets or a container. And that level of economics tied to crisis management really helps you then rethink the ability to look at new technologies that would drive some of your new decision making on how you monitor the cold chain. So as an example, some of the things that we're doing with pharma companies, we're working very, very closely with companies that even use envirotainers. And these, as for folks that don't know, are very specialized containers that can be plugged into power, but really then can contain, the contents of a pallet that can move around. We're working with companies that move, I'd say, room temperature food. So it could be things such as, perishables, could be bread, it could be other types of produce that are not necessarily in cold chain. And in these environments, what we're looking for are a multitude of sensors. And I talked about humidity, I talked about pressure, we're talking about natural organic gases such as ethylene that can help with the ability to ripen food. if you will, along the lines of the food chain. In all of this, what we're looking to do as a summary in 30 minutes that we had was kind of provide you with 2 or 3 takeaways. One is there is technology today. We call it IoT, we call it condition monitoring, we call it the enhanced supply chain that is economically cheaper than probably some of the solutions used in the traditional visibility of supply chain. An example would be where we're working with a soda producer, if you will, that is looking at 1 million to 1.5 million dispensers that are, refrigerated soda dispensers. And what they want to know is if they're actually on and if they're cold. And being able to have non-wired sensors that can detect temperature, humidity, and light to tell if the power is on and be deployed without any operational infrastructure changes the way the cold chain now is going to look at complete visibility. These are some of the examples, if you will, that the future is going to bring to us, where it's not the traditional warehouse, it's not the traditional truck with the GPS and temperature logger. It's going to be the areas where we thought it was not possible. And all of this ties back to the connectivity, being able to then get information into a cloud-based environment economically, and being able to deploy sensors, if you will, without having to wire anything in all of this. Some of the customers, the reason I want to talk through some of these is the different types of industries that are looking to work with this. So some that would be completely non-intuitive. Building materials. We have a lot of situations where iron and steel in certain grades cannot rust, if you will. And that's really part of the environmental chain, not necessarily the cold chain. Consumer goods, chocolates, and movement within a room temperature environment of 25 to 30 Fahrenheit. Looking at chemicals where they can have the potential for contamination, if you will, with some of the changes in the environment. And understandably, pharmaceutical and electrical manufacturing, where the conditions not just for moisture, but also for temperature apply. I wanted to kind of conclude on that note, and we'll probably open it up for some questions and look to hear some of the comments.
Thank you, Vidya and Z. We are now going to begin answering the questions submitted during today's presentation. As a reminder, you can still submit the questions through the questions pane in your attendee control panel. Our first question is, do you support 2G both here and in the rest of the world?
Okay, thank you, James. I'll go ahead and address that question. As people may be aware of what is happening in the cellular industry, 2G is on the wane. If you look at in the United States coverage maps today, the 2 major carriers that were providing 2G services across the entire landmass of the United States, one of them has shut down their 2G network. The other one has not yet made any announcements, but you can see the handwriting on the wall within the next 2 to 3 years maximum on the GSM side. On the 2G CDMA side, that's still in play and will continue to stay in play for at least 2 to 5 years, depending on the nature of how well the low power wide area networks continue to get deployed. Now, globally, in the rest of the world, 2G is still in play, particularly in countries where they have no incentive or need to worry about transitioning away from low-cost handsets that their customers may be using. However, that is also subject to change. So I would say that within the next 5 to 7 years, you'll start seeing countries remove 2G. It has already happened in certain countries, like, for example, in Singapore, there is no 2G service available at the present time. So there will be an evolution away from 2G. And as that cellular changes primarily to 4G in many cases, 3G in certain countries, and ultimately 5G down the road.
All right, next question. GDPR is EU specific to data privacy and privacy for individuals. Not sure how IoT impacts this regulation.
That's a good question. In fact, I would preface it by saying that the GDPR regulations are extremely confusing. It isn't just a matter of the privacy of the data from an individual. It turns out that if you can correlate data being sent on behalf of a product that is being used by an end user, including an individual who can be identified and related to that data from that product, then that is an issue. That is a concern under GDPR. The other comment I would emphasize is that while people assume that GDPR only applies to the European Union in particular, it turns out that the effect can be fairly widespread, meaning that if you originate the data from, let's say, a truck in the EU, but that data is transported to a server in the United States or outside the EU, it is still something subject to the GDPR regulation. So if that individual's data or the data that needs to be private resides on a server in the United States and somebody in the United States goes and accesses that data, even though that individual and the data are not within the EU, the GDPR regulations still apply. So you have to be very careful about that, particularly because the penalties associated with violating that rule are extremely dangerous. For a global operation like ourselves or any company that is operating globally, to have penalties that apply to your global revenue, not just your EU revenue, is pretty significant.
Thank you. Next question. What is holding pharma back replacing existing equipment and the reluctance to change the current validated systems?
Yeah, let me hand that question to you.
Thanks, Z. And it's a very good question. Pharma in itself is very regulated, and the regulations drive to two things. One is liability for non-compliance and the ability to show that you're consistently in compliance. One of the things that we've noticed is that pharma is willing to look at new technologies, but the implementation comes down to it being very, very easy to adopt. And by easy, I mean two things. They're able to show their quality control departments that this indeed meets all NIST certifications. This indeed does meet all the, CFR regulations, and it's easy on the process change. Pharma today is, it's a very old industry, and it's really driven by a very regimented process of putting data loggers, if you will, on it, being able to send it to QC on reaching a destination, printing a report, accepting the product, and then filing the report. The concept of real-time acknowledgement and the ability to receive it in a certified manner is now being demonstrated, not just at the pharma level, but at the food level by Roambee. So now we've been able to have sensors that are fully NIST certified, that are in compliance with the reporting standards, and are being certified by quality control departments. I think it's going to be, where one or two large companies are the movers, and a lot of the other companies are the followers. So if you look at the pharma food chain, you're going to look at a lot of the suppliers that supply to the larger entities will follow and comply if the larger entities are able to make the breakthroughs. And we're seeing that change already.
Thank you, Vidya. We have a couple more questions. This one is about what the sensors look like. What do the sensor devices look like? Could you describe that?
Sure. The sensors actually come in a variety of form factors. The smallest ones we have are about the size of a quarter, and these could be very much in the context of a very small coin cell battery that can potentially last 4 to 5 years, that can tell you everything from temperature, humidity, and pressure to gases, to larger, more portable infrastructure that uses cellular backhaul. And those could be the size of a cigarette pack that could last 90 to 100 days. The sensors by themselves, and we touched upon the different communication technologies, really now are getting to be smaller because the communication technologies now are using different ways to then reduce the form factors. So if you look at Bluetooth as a technology that's really now coming into the fray, if you look at narrowband, we talked about that, which is revolutionizing IoT from the ability to send data to the cloud, to even cellular, where you're looking at different categories of LTE that make the form factors very, very small. So in reality, in 4 to 5 years, you're going to see it probably the size of a thumbtack, but right now it's small enough to embed at the item level.
Perfect, thank you. Next question, do you offer pay-per-use plans?
Absolutely. Sorry.
Vidya,
yeah. So one of the plans that we do is it's completely pay-per-use and pay-per-grow. So we wanted to be completely OpEx. We also wanted to be a flat rate. That's one of the reasons we work very well with Aeris. What we want to do is provide our customers with a single fee. So for example, if you're looking to track product across the continental US or the world using cellular technologies, we're able to provide you that visibility at $1 a day. If you're looking at item level that could tie back to the cellular technologies, we're looking at $1 a month. So it's completely scalable. It's completely non-contract driven. So the ability to start and try and experience and grow makes this very adoptable. There's no budgeting exercise that needs to go through to enable people to actually experience this. And that's a breakthrough, because traditionally what's happened is there's a lot of hidden costs. You buy some hardware, now you have to buy some connectivity, plus you pay some monthly access fees, things of that nature. But all that is going away into a single point price, which then provides not just the service, the connectivity, the hardware, but also the visibility and support.
Let me also add to that, James, with the question. In the IoT space, we have to worry about a variety of different, let me call them rate plans, if you will, ranging from very low access, monthly recurring fee access kind of charges, all the way up through where there is a substantial amount of data being sent. The good news about IoT is that it tends to be consistent within the application in general. So you can create a variety of rate plans and do automated motion, if you will, moving a device within the rate plan to optimize the cost of the device. Those are all rules that we set up in our billing systems to accommodate the variety of different kinds of applications. We have applications that send maybe a few tens of kilobytes a month, all the way up to something that may be transmitting a device that may be transmitting 500 megabytes or maybe even a gigabyte or two a month. And that range is large, but more importantly, it tends to be consistent within the application, so you can optimize the plan. And if you need a pay-per-use plan, yes, we have similar kinds of plans where you essentially buy a SIM, and if it is a small, small device, and then as you use it, you pay for it. You don't use it, you don't pay for it. It's that straightforward.
Well, thank you, Vidya, and thank you, Z. And thank you, everyone, for attending today's webinar. If you have any other questions, didn't get your questions answered, please contact our speakers via the information they shared or by contacting GCCA headquarters. Once you leave today's webinar, you will receive a follow-up email within 24 to 48 hours with a link to view the recording of today's webinar or share with other team members. On behalf of the Global Cold Chain Alliance and our sponsors, and our presenters, thank you for joining us today, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, James.
Thank you, James.